to understand what a glider cell is and how that relates to this game and this paradigm shift, I want you to just quickly watch this video. It'll explain the basis of what's going on here. Can you all hear this?
Back in the 1970s, an unexpected breakthrough was made by a mathematician named John Conway, here in Cambridge. He devised something called the game of life, a simple simulation that shows how a complex thing like the mind might come about from a basic set of rules. The simulation consists of a grid, a bit like a chessboard, extending infinitely in all directions. Each square of the grid can either be lit up, which he called alive, or dark, which he called dead. Whether a given square is dead or alive depends on what is happening in the 8 other squares that surround it. For example, if a living square like this one has no living squares nearby, the rules say it will die of loneliness. If a living square is surrounded by more than 3 other living squares, the square will also die of overcrowding. But if a dead square is surrounded by 3 living squares, it becomes lit, or is born. Once you set an initial state of living squares and let the simulation run, these simple laws determine what happens in the future. The results are surprising. As the program progresses, shapes appear and disappear spontaneously. Collections of shapes move across the grid, bouncing off one another. There are whole kinds of objects, species, that interact. Some can even reproduce, just as life does in the real world. These complex properties emerge from simple laws that contain no concepts like movement or reproduction. It's possible to imagine that something like the game of life, with only a few basic laws, might produce highly complex features. Perhaps even intelligence. It might take a grid with many billions of squares, but that's not surprising. We have many hundreds of billions of cells in our brains.
Okay, so the thing I wanted you to get out of this is that you can have a simple set of rules, and from that, you can get some complex interactions. And the metaphor that you're going to see later when you watch what was happening in my game is that if you have students sitting in rows, not interacting, if you have isolated students not interacting, if they're not doing any kind of a game or a project, and they're just interacting with text in a textbook, according to this, they die. There's basically no life. There's no evolution. And I thought this was the perfect metaphor. In fact, when I was reading about Conway and the game of life, I started to get this kind of shiver in the spine, as though I was discovering, I guess, what they would call the God particle, like the very substance of life. And what they didn't talk about in this video is what happened about, I don't know how many iterations, maybe hundreds of iterations into the program. There was something called a glider. and it split off from these chaotic regions and these orderly regions, and it found the most efficient way to go across that grid. Now, it was never programmed to do that. It just did it spontaneously. That was kind of the spooky part of the research. And so I saw that as, if you control things too much from the top down, whether it's a democracy, whether it's a business, whether it's a classroom, you're not going to get that more efficient movement across the grid. You're not going to get that creativity and that spark. And that's all I needed to see to know that I was kind of on the right path in building this game. So let's get back to the slideshow here. All right, so an example of where this complexity works, you see it every day in the biosphere. Millions of variables interacting, and we can't have any type of order. There is no top-down control of this. It is interacting in a way that we can't predict the weather, for example, past 10 or 15 days, yet it's responsible for life. So that is an example of a complex system and why complexity can work. I could go in deep here on non-equilibrium thermodynamics, but I'll just read a couple parts of this. The concept of entropy derives from thermodynamics and is a part of the second law of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics, according to the Encarta World Dictionary or English Dictionary, refers to a branch of physics dealing with the conversions of energy from one form or another and how these affect temperature, pressure, volume, mechanical action, and work. I'd go on further, but I'll just quickly explain that in a thermodynamic system, you lose energy. In a non-equilibrium thermodynamic system, you have new energy coming into the system, and it basically overturns the second law. So in thermodynamics, certain things are true, such as losing heat when transferring one form of energy to another. This would make perfect efficiency impossible. In addition, Glick, as he pronounces his name, in 1987 pointed out that the universe, because of this, was a one-way street. A process tending towards disorder could not be reversed. These things may be true in the world of thermodynamics, he pointed out, but are not so true in complexity. He went on to say that thermodynamics did not explain the creating of amino acids, microorganisms, self-reproducing plants and animals, and the complexity even of the human brain. Systems such as these did not fall victim to entropy, but rose to a higher level. And once again, I come across this and I think, aha, everyone is trying to have all of this order, but it turns out that complexity is good. It's a good thing. It prevents entropy. We've got all kinds of interactions going on. Again, I saw this as a good metaphor for the classroom. Okay, now that we have the theoretical part covered, I'm going to tell you the story of, I wanted you to see that first so that you could understand kind of what I discovered after the fact. But now that you have this in mind, when you hear the story, I think you'll understand why it worked out the way that it did. And then if this turns out to be a breakthrough, which is the criterion for the Falling Walls contest, what are the impediments to doing this on a large scale? In other words, if this is a real paradigm shift and it's something that we ought to be doing, how can we get it done? And that'll be something we can discuss. So here's the story. Initially, I get into teaching. I had seen the movie Dead Poet Society, and I thought, yeah, that sounds like something I want to do. I want to be the guy in front of the classroom, inspiring students and doing something meaningful. But here's what happens. I come into a classroom. The school year had already started. I got hired because the classes were overcrowded, and the principal I would say, made a mistake. What he did was he went around to the overcrowded classes and he said on a piece of paper, anyone who would like to transfer out of this overcrowded class, just put your name on this paper. And turns out anyone who was not doing well, as in C minus, D, and F students, all signed up for my class. Then on top of that, I'm teaching a world history course, which covers 10,000 years of recorded human history, and it's over 800 pages. And so I'm under a lot of pressure to make this all work. So the students were not having this. I'd repeat some of the things that I heard, but since this is being recorded, I'm probably not going to say all the things that I heard in the course of those 2 weeks before I started this project. I was not trained for this. And in fact, I was sort of developing a nervous twitch in my face because every time you want to yell or scream or use a swear word, you can't, because teachers are not supposed to do that. Whoops. So I put this video together to describe what I thought was the problem going on and why we need to do this project. And then I'll explain how the project works once you see the fundamentals of everything that's going wrong. Okay, so that explains what I think are the fundamentals of the problem. Too much order and control, Lack of interaction, students kind of confined to learning just the content in the text, but not relating it to other classes, not seeing the connection to the outside world, and all this pressure on testing. So these are actual pictures from some of the first years of playing the game. And as you can see on the back wall, they one of the first things is preparation. They have to produce a game board, which is a map that takes up the entire wall of the classroom. The students you see over on the right side became the United Nations. Those were the honor students who were keeping track, basically the referees in the game. And what you see in the middle here is gameplay. It's a kind of a horseshoe arrangement of deaths around the map. And I'll explain how the game works in just a second. But what they're spinning there is called the Wheel of Knowledge, where students create their own questions and then have to answer those for points. But we'll get to that just 1 second. Okay, so the idea is they take this book and rather than read it, answer the questions at the end of the chapter, try to commit content or knowledge to memory, which then goes on a quiz, a multiple choice test, an essay, a final exam, midterm, whatever. Instead, they write up 20 questions per week and divide it into these categories. At least this is how it's divided up in a world history class. You have to write that many questions in history, geography, vocabulary, people, trivia. A current event, something happening right now, could be the climate crisis, could be the fires in California, could be anything happening around them so they can make knowledge relevant. And then something from one of their other classes so they can see the connection between what they're learning in one class to that of another class. These all get entered into the little widgets there on the wheel, and then the wheel is spun around. The classes can decide how they do the questions. This is kind of a basic rundown of the rules, and I'll just quickly go through this because we could spend all day just talking about the rules. And I think kind of the paradigm, the fundamentals of the game are more important than the actual details of the game itself. So these were the instructions for a mobile version of the game that I wanted to put out. And they're very simple. So you answer questions in order to get points, which gives you territory on a global map and possibly for digital money if we decide to go that direction. But you're dealt out cards of all the different countries on Earth, and each country has a value equal to its per capita income, which I'll explain in a second. You can insert any content for any course to play this game and answer those questions in exchange for points. And when you get the question right, you get to defend your country or take over another country on that map, or you can work for peace, you can work for war. And this all takes place while you're going through 4 phases of human history, which we're not going to really have a chance to get into, but let's just say that this goes through 20 different rounds of the game. And as we go through those rounds, you enter into different phases of history and different team configurations. But the number of questions is in direct proportion to an amount of territory you want to occupy. So for example, if you want to take over China or the United States, you're going to have to answer more questions. And so every step along the way, you're giving incentives to the students to want to learn more, study more, gather more information. Okay, so approximately 200 countries on Earth. The number of questions, like I said, is aligned to the per capita income. There are also categories for, square mileage, money accumulated. You can incentivize this with other things too, for example, in peace initiatives or in solving particular problems as we get into the later phases of the game. So basically, this is how it works. Like a digital version might look like what you see in the moving video, where you have a list of all these countries and who occupies them and what their per capita income is. And I just gave you three basic examples here. You've got Norway, which is valued in this game at $67,176 US. China would be 10,484, although I was told from Demetrius, who is one of our advisors, who worked and lived and taught in China for 8 years, that their spending power is actually greater, even though the per capita income is 10,484. It seems low, but they have greater purchasing power with prices being low and maybe subsidized by the government. And then we got South Africa, which surprised me is only 5,067. So students quickly learn by playing this game the inequalities that exist globally in income distribution. They see all the inequities that exist around the world. Now, as far as the criticism I initially received was, well, this is a game and you're having a lot of fun, but are you covering the required content, the state standards? So I put this chart together. During the course of this game, you'll see that they cover all 40 chapters. They go through 4 phases of human history. They have answered in the course of this game over 1,800 questions, and questions that they wrote themselves are 400. And as many people in education will tell you, questions are more important than the answers, because it means that if you really understand information, you'll be able to ask a question about it. Just answering something that you memorized doesn't necessarily mean you understand the information. Okay, so where we are in the development of the actual game, the product that needs to go out to the world, the first phase is already done. I put together a handbook that went out to teachers all over the world. I gave it out mostly for free using LinkedIn. There was a social studies group, and I just gave it out to whoever wanted it. And then when I thought, I would love to be compensated for this, I've put years and years of effort. And so I charged, I think, $4.95 for the workbook. And when I mentioned this on the LinkedIn group, they said, you're out of here. And I actually got kicked out of the group. So it's weird when you make the transition from being a teacher to being an entrepreneur, because somehow they think you're not being true to the mission of an educator. Well, I wasn't being sponsored by an institution, and I left the school where I was teaching for a number of reasons. There was a lot of problems happening at that school, which I'd be happy to tell you about privately. And so I went and did independent work. There was a lot of violence and just horrible aggressive behavior and some mismanagement and just some things happening there that I wasn't happy to be a part of. So the second iteration was that students and teachers create a unique game, but then they bend the rules to suit their unique requirements. The rule book is still written much like a textbook with top-down instructions. And only when I put together this new advisory group did I realize, wow, what a hypocrite. Here I am preaching this idea of bottom-up interaction and not trying to enforce anything on students, yet we're writing a book that is essentially top down and saying, these are the rules, here's how you play the game. So one of the guys in our group, and I'm very thankful for this, he studied games as part of an anthropology PhD program. And he came up with this idea that we'll have characters explain the game. And then I wanted to take it one step further by saying, why don't we have the students look in on the discussion and decide for themselves how they want to build this project? So they're kind of watching this. There's something in football, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, called the all 22 shot. They never show it. It is where they have the blimp show you all 22 players on the field from above. And I was reading a Sports Illustrated article that said they don't show it because when you see that, you see all the mistakes happening. Like the quarterback didn't see the wide receiver, he was wide open. Or you see missed tackles or missed blocks. And you're not able to see the story taking place because you can't see the look on the quarterback's face or the linebacker's face, and you're missing out on the real nuts and bolts of what's happening in the game. So what we do in this latest version we're working on is we give them an all 22 shot that they get to feel powerful, the omniscient person reading this and think, wow, here's something we can do with this to make it relevant to this class or to this school. And they feel like they're a part of something. And there's all kinds of evidence that companies that do this, for example, Google, I know, gives 10 or 20% of employee time to creating your own product. In the former Soviet Union, for example, 30% of the land was private, 70% was public. The 30% would often outproduce the 70% because they had ownership in it. And so I believe from everything I've seen that if students and the teacher feel like they can take this and become creative themselves and feel like they're doing, being treated respectfully like professionals, that they can be a part of the creative process, then it will become more widely used than, say, a textbook. And students will actually learn about not only the content of their course, but in solving real problems taking place on Earth right now. That brings us to the final slide, which is kind of the overall theme. The right answer to a trivial question is also trivial, but the right question, even when insoluble in exact form, is a guide to major discovery. That was E.O. Wilson who said that. And so when you write your own questions, when you solve your own problems, it's very empowering and it's more of a learning process. And that's the theme that this project is built on. And I'll be open for any of your questions. Let's see, how do I turn the share off? There we go.
Lee, I have a comment. I don't have a question.
Go ahead, man.
Sure.
Your game reminded me of Bucky Fuller.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because I played the World Game with him and with other people several times, so since like the 1970s. And that was it was designed to bring a learning process and solve world problems and make the world work. I mean, the ultimate game was to make the world work.
Yeah.
So, when you're using the word game and design and your approach, it brought back memories. I would just wanted to know if you were aware of Bucky Fuller's World Game.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I was doing some research on that. I wanted to know as much as I could about that game, and I was watching an interview with him from 1974, and
Yeah.
he was so far ahead of his time.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. And
I don't want to take too much of your time in case.
No. I'd love to learn more from you about your experience there.
Well, yeah, we did it, and we also played it one time just related to the topic, also sustainability, with Peter Senge, the Learning Organization Society I was part of, Society for Organizational Learning. We had a big conference just on sustainability about 20 years ago, and we played the World Game with all, with people in it. It was like 4 hours, in it, but people get to see quickly this, systems. Peter Senge is a big systems thinker. So you got to teach systems to people also, as well as questioning. So I would throw in the capacity of systems thinking, which a lot of schools don't teach. because you got to see that, as you said in your slide, everything is interconnected. The earth, the people, the earth, everything is systemic. Yeah. And I would say it's one piece that I tried to bring into my work of leadership. And I also would recommend you this book by a friend of Lenny. You know, Paul, you may know this guy, right? Thomas, you
Oh,
know
yeah.
who he is?
Yes.
Well, I think this is a must-read book by everyone in this group. The World We Create.
The author is,
Thomas Jorkman, BJORK,
oh yeah,
Thomas Jorkman. And the reason I bring it up because if you combine what you're doing with Bucky Fuller's original intention of, because his point was, we created the history of the world, we created the world we live in, but we can also transform it. And he created the world game to help humans take ownership of the spaceship Earth, meaning ownership, meaning becoming the custodians, the pilots. Where Bucky was short of was, I would say, on the how we humans interact with each other. He was so technical that he forgot that we humans are also a little weird animals. You know, we and we you know, we are tribal. We have human natures, like E.O. Wilson would say. You quote E.O. Wilson. In this book, Thomas brings that up from the subtitle, From God to Market. He said, we created God, we created a market, and now we are creating climate change. And then the next thing after that, should we create a meta-modern world in which we create a sustainable civilization? But you gotta get the point is that we humans are the problem and we humans are the solution. We created the climate change. We created the games. We created blah, blah, blah. You get the point. And he gives you a methodology how to do that, which Bucky did not do. So this is where Bucky fell short, I think. Peter Senge tried to do a little bit more by saying, okay, we create organizations and we are systems thinker. But Peter, you know, Peter Senge kind of stop our organization, but we have to take it to, well, we got to create the society, the civilization. Or anyway, so I'm just saying, I think you're in good hands.
yeah.
Right.
It. Go ahead.
But sorry. I think it was great. It was a great presentation, but I want to ask you, so you quoted Edward Wilson, and you quote your quote was on asking the right question. And so my thought there is, how do the students know to ask the right questions? They have to be well versed in the material, I would think, or maybe not.
Right. And so that's the key right there, is that they soon realize that in order to ask a good question, they have to first understand the content.
Right.
So they will read, but they're not being told to read. They're being told to ask a question.
Yes.
So it's more of a natural, like emergent process. Well, I better read this or ask some people what this means, and then we'll form questions. But there's also another aspect to this that happens in this game, which is collaboration. That because a lot of this is built around points and incentives, you'll see more advanced learners work with low achieving students and say, we need you to score really high because our team needs more resources, more money.
Yes.
So we're going to work with you. We're going to bring you up to speed, help you write questions, because when they hand those in at the end of the week, they're turned in for money, game money, 20 points or $20,000. And so the better the question, if your question gets turned down by the honors students, they all work collaboratively to review those questions to make sure that they're good. So that's another aspect of it.
Yeah, it's a great concept, because I'm thinking back to my days, and a lot of times we learn dates. So when was the Emancipation Proclamation created? What date versus what forces were at play that caused the Emancipation Proclamation to come about? We never asked that. And so it's great you're getting the wheels to turn. And anyways, I think it's great.
Yeah, and that does bring up something too about quantification and another systemic problem to Manuel's point about systems at work here, which is standardized testing and quantification. The grading system as it stands now, you need numbers to make that work. And so one of the reasons, like we were probably all asked about dates, is you can give a specific answer and that can be graded either correct or not correct. Whereas some kind of an interpretive answer, it's a little bit more difficult. And I tried doing this once, by the way, as a teacher, where I gave nothing but higher order Bloom's taxonomy, synthesizing information questions. And I remember it took me more hours than were available between the test date and when the answers were due. And I had to bring in outside help to get those graded. So that's got to be fixed too. Oh, Manuel.
Just quickly, Lee, you will be, I guess, attending the Global Bildung, right?
Yes.
Okay. There will be a presentation there from Chile, two people of a group that I support in Chile that's called La Nueva Educación, the New Education. And the New Education is pretty philosophically in alignment with you. So you will find that these two people will be saying things that you agree with. And specifically, they are, you could say, they go beyond information learning to critical thinking, learning to learn, what do we learn for? And also based on project-based learning. So it's a lot of project-based and team building learning. So I think you're going to find the presentation from the Chile group interesting. They are 6-minute presentation on new education.
That's great.
And Carlos knows a little bit about, because he's also participating with the Latin American group. So I just want you to know that there's already people experimenting with some of this in Latin America.
That's fantastic. I wished I could get my presentation down to 6 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, let me just tell you that they asked me for their conference, which was a few months ago, to say everything I had to say in 2 minutes in a video. So you could do it. I mean, you could do it. You train yourself to do it in a 2-minute video.
Yeah.
It's powerful because then you could put it on Instagram and other things.
Yeah. Good point.
Okay,
I think Brandon's had his hand up for quite a while. Brandon?
Yeah. So as you know, I've been talking to you about this for a while, and I actually helped you out with it, a little bit last year, and just had some discussions about the theory behind it. So one thing that we were talking about was how loose or strict rules should be in order to bring about positive emergent phenomena. And as you were even getting into something that we never talked about before, which was the thermodynamics aspect. Like there's a certain way in which these foundational rules, I guess, can lead to emergent phenomena. I would think though, if you have 0 rules, you're not going to get that. It's just going to be chaos. If you have too many rules, as we usually do things in education now, and this is their whole point. You're saying too many rules, then you get people education that's failing, and you got into all that. So but we also don't want to have 0 rules. So did you kind of figure out that optimal balance, and can you speak to that?
No, that's a great question. In fact, that is the most important question that this advisory group is dealing with right now. And many of the answers I'm getting are Lee, we need more rules and we need more details. And so I just sent them the video that I showed you earlier, that there's 4 lines of code in that cellular automata game, and it iterates wildly. In the initial game, I gave them such basic instructions. It was, we have to insert this, holding the textbook, into this game. And I gave them a framework for the game, and I outlined that in about 10 minutes, and they took off. Remember, these were the students who were doing really poorly. And if I could have just captured the excitement and shown that to you right now, it was so transformative for me, just as a human being watching that. And I'm not the person to discover this. I have to just mention quickly that my dad did work with juvenile offenders back in the 60s and 70s, and he had passed along some of those same ideas to me about respect and acknowledgement, that you have to show some faith. And basically, there is a power dynamic shift going on here too that I didn't mention, which is that you are saying, I'm not the grand holder of all knowledge and information, and I'm not going to impart that on you so much as we're going to partner in building this. I'm going to guide you like a coach. So anyway, back to Brandon's question real quick. We haven't found that balance yet. I want this final document to be in story form and open and under 20 pages. It has to just be usable and in an easy to understand language with pictures. Afzal?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I think I've been involved in talking to you about this as well. My sense of this in regards to whether too many rules or 0 rules, I was just talking out loud right now, thinking about if we have some guiding principles, foundational principles, such as how we would make sure that the motivation is intrinsic, it's not extrinsic. So, and it's based on earnest desire to learn. So it is not conditioned by the outside, socioeconomic environment you live in. Because that's the main problem, that there's a seed of intention in every one of us. And unfortunately, that's not nurtured by the educational systems due to those extrinsic motives for seeking getting a job, right? But if it is intrinsic and you want to learn something and it is earnest and objective, I don't know how that could be like a guiding principle or the light for doing this. And to be honest with you, I don't know how that could be incorporated into a concept which is game-based and it's mostly rivalry-based. But I think that may be something that then, whether we have too many rules or too little rules, it will guide it in the right way. So I don't know if this makes sense to you guys or not. I'm going to leave in about 5 minutes, but that's what I wanted to kind of propose.
Let me just quickly answer that before you have to take off, because I have a couple of thoughts on that. So number one, it doesn't have to be rivalrous, and I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head, but in this new iteration of the game, you could say, all right, every dollar amount that we raise, every question that we get correct goes into like this imaginary fund to solve a world problem. So it's the class competing against that problem, whether it's climate crisis or whether it's, one of the problems they're solving too is in creating their own version of the game. So the challenge that for example, I had a class that didn't like the rivalry aspect of it, and they just wanted to keep the game going, answering questions, doing the fun things like music and making team logos and all the design work, all the organizing of information in their own methods. They just love that aspect of it, learning on their own. And so they just kept that going as long as possible. thinking that, well, as long as they did that, I would never go back to regular teaching. And eventually I had to get back to getting them ready for some tests, bringing it all together. But what was your other point was about, I forget, there was one other quick point you mentioned besides the rivalry aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I just said if we somehow incorporate some basic guiding principles, because I think that's what we're driving for, is to bring out intrinsic motivation for learning.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so
I wanted to speak to that real quick. You could have a set of questions that, or actually a character in the, because remember this rule book's going to be told by characters, and one of those characters might speak to all the different guiding principles of, learning methods or types of intelligence, that every type of intelligence matters. And if you're an abstract learner versus a logical kind of person, that's okay. And here's what you might do. And, we want to let them know that every type of learner matters in this. And so one student may write questions from the textbook that are based on solving actual problems, or one might be very business oriented and write up questions that relate to modern business. Like these are the kind of businesses they ran back in ancient Egypt. How does that relate to what an entrepreneur deals with today? Things like that. So yeah, I think it's wide open, and if we make the framework broad enough, and we just let teachers take it from there, that we're doing them a favor. Manuel, are you taking off? I can't hear you.
I thank you. Good work. Keep in touch. I need to go to a doctor's phone call.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Hope to talk to you soon.
Good to see you all. Keep going. Good presentation. Love it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, you all.
So I want to follow up with you on, if you recall, we were talking about some of this, and where you were working on my project a little bit, I was working on yours. We did a little bit of a trade, and I suggested putting in a flow chart because you had some rules. And I said, well, maybe someone could see where to go next within this flow chart, and it would have a lot of different open-ended things, so it would still be complex, adaptive, but you would at least have that flow chart, and I started putting it together. And then I wasn't sure if you wanted to use that or if you wanted to keep it so, even more open than any flow chart could capture.
No, that's a great idea. I still have that and all of your notes. Yeah, I remember you diagrammed that it looked a lot like a circuit board or something, if I remember correctly. It had kind of a software feel to it.
Yeah. So basically a flow chart is essentially it's for, it could be for organizations, or what do I do, or what paths do I go through? And it does actually look like a circuit board, because that's what circuit boards do. It's like, electricity goes through here. It has a logic gate, like, oh, do we do this or do that? So there's something to that.
Okay.
But it wouldn't necessarily need to be strict, because some of these decision points could essentially be so open-ended. It's just that, there's a certain pattern to the game. There's certain phases, there's certain times where you need to make decisions on things, so that's just a basic structure. Would be easy to envision, which could still be changed. You could say, hey, here's a way of doing things.
Yeah, that would be a good
possible way of doing things. You can change it,
No, I like the idea. It would be good to use as one example of how one class might flow this out. But rather than the kind of the binary nature of computing systems, I want the metaphor to be more like quantum computing, that, millions of possible combinations, faster, more iterative. And I think it was to Manuel's point about the game of life, that I've seen the typical hierarchical chart of how things get done through institutions. And imagine if you flipped it over, that now you've got 8 billion people, and imagine the number of, if they were tasked properly, because I thought about this, when you have one teacher and 150 students at a high school, I was able to build this game real quickly. The problem was making sure everyone had tasks. Like, for example, we did a television version of this game for community access TV, and everyone was given a certain role. And everyone was able to contribute something, and I wondered if that was extended to the globe, where now billions of people who would normally not think that they could make a difference in, for example, the climate crisis, or in the elimination of poverty or economic opportunity, now all of a sudden had something that they could do. So the idea is to empower students in this way, by flipping that model. Mike, did you have any questions?
I had one, but somebody else asked it,
okay.
so I'm good.
Okay.
I have a question. Yeah.
Sure.
So at one point, Lee, you talked about questions that were related to history, geography, vocabulary, people, trivia. How about substituting ecological footprint instead of trivia? Because climate change is here, and knowing how much that country consumes energy is going to be very important. And so I'm going to send you in the chat. I talked about this last time. If you go to this website, it gives you a breakout of each country. So the world can sustain 1.6 global hectares. The US consumes 8. Ecuador is a perfect 1. So they consume as much as they produce. Norway is a 5. But this will give kids a sense not only of the population, geography, of what's going on from a resource perspective. And, who knew that Ecuador is a model for consumption, and countries like Nigeria, Chile, that you normally wouldn't consider to be a world power, are going to become very prominent because they have a lot of natural resources. So something to consider.
Yeah. So something needs to be explained so that you understand that. Oh, first, Afzal, do you need to take off?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you all, guys. And
Thanks.
I'll join you guys later. Bye.
I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing that needs mentioning is, and this is an excellent point, that we had one wheel that we used for all 4 phases of history, but really we need different categorization of knowledge based on, because one of the things I wanted students to do was to simulate what it's like going through each phase of history that got us to the present. And by doing that, they get to see how these problems started and why we're still kind of stuck in a 20th century or 19th century mindset in a lot of ways, education included, using this factory model as an example, or using early industrialization, ecological solutions that aren't making any sense anymore. So based on whatever phase of history we're going through, we need a different wheel. And the people who I recruit to finish the final version of this game should probably help me in designing that so it makes sense. Because that is not a 21st century wheel. That did not include all the current things we're dealing with at all. And you're muted, by the way.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I agree. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Carlos,
what about questions? You, Carlos?
No, the only thing that I have to, as an observation, it seemed like in the middle of the presentation right there, you touched a little bit on the aspect of the game of civilization, in which you try to build kingdoms and by wars and banking and other activities. Seemed like you touched a little bit very close to that idea. That game is very attractive to me. I think it's a great idea behind it. So that was great, and your presentation was great as well. I like the analogy, or at least the information about nature, and the what seems to be chaotic actually creates life, diversity, and everything. So that was a very good point. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is antithetical to how we behave as human beings. A typical, or many typical, I should say, principals or people in authority think, oh, that looks very clean and orderly. It must be going well. That teacher has control over the classroom. I don't know. I haven't been a teacher for a while, so I know that I'm not correct in saying that it's still like that. I know that there's projects and games and computer simulations and all kinds of things going on in classes, but I would say that the majority of the world in education is still being done, in this factory model. Students in rows, using textbooks, memorizing information, taking tests. I mean, standardized testing, I think there's only 2 or 3 colleges nationwide that don't consider standardized testing in their formula for admitting students. I think one of them is in California. I think maybe UCLA or something. But yeah, so I like what you said about chaos and nature, that we see it as beautiful. Not every, when we go into nature, we don't see it manicured, and it's still beautiful. It's not being touched by human hand, but it seems to be knowing what to do. Now, the problem I ran into, just to let you know, is I did present the idea. I was encouraged to present the idea at a research competition back when I was getting my my master's degree on this topic. And does anyone want to guess why I was thrown out of the competition?
You got me curious.
Yeah, I wasn't thrown out, in a negative way, but I'll just say I was in the first round, and then I was told I would not be going on any further. And it was one of the older professors came out of the judging room, and this was over at California State University, Sacramento. And he said, well, your presentation caused the most interesting conversation in the judging lounge, but you can't move on in this competition because you can't quantify any of this, that this phenomenon actually exists in human behavior, in the classroom, that it's related. You can't prove that these metaphors are real. I mean, you can't say, for example, that just because you saw Conway's Game of Life and 4 lines of code and how that worked, that students are going to behave that same way. And that is, I shouldn't say this on a recorded call, but I need help in being able to prove that. Other than, you see it in corporations where they have this lateral distribution of power, and it does work. Like Microsoft experimented with this in the 90s, Google. So I know it can work, and I know that people do feel empowered when they're not being talked down to. I mean, that's just a psychological phenomenon. But that's why I didn't move on further in the contest.
I put in the chat your questions, Lee, just to make sure the group can address them. So I think we addressed the first couple of questions, and how can it be effectively packaged? Do you feel like we've answered that?
We're wrestling with that right now. The goal was due to the contest was I felt an obligation to have something to show other than the research and the ideas and the website and all that, but to have an actual product to show by the time the contest came around, just in case we all go on to the final round. And so that means November 1st, which means we would only have this month and next month to complete a product. So I'm thinking about just some kind of I mean, and I'd love your input on this, but I'm thinking about seriously just a very broad digital reader, not in hardback form or anything like that, but just a digital reader with characters telling the story of how this can work. And leaving it open, you know, and asking for, hey, if you still have questions, guess what? Solve the problem. Show us your answer. We'll put it on our website. We'll share it with the world.
I can't believe you got pushback about charging $4, but it's crazy.
I know. I don't know. You know, and that's another puzzle too, is I am self-financed right now.
Right.
I've gotten some donations, even by some nice folks in the room here. And I appreciate that. But going forward, it's tough. I'm doing some part-time project work that pays the bills, but ask any entrepreneur or people in the nonprofit world, you know, how do you do it?
Well, I think it's needed. Hopefully you get some interest out there. I think it's great. Now, one question I would have is, if I'm a real history buff and I want to take AP US history, will this class help me? You know, just, I know it's kind of trivial, but some kids want to take that.
Yeah, and the simple answer is that not only will it help you, but it'll give you additional things that you wouldn't get from a normal AP class. So you just insert all the AP questions into the game. For example, one possible solution is there is a platform called Quizlet, where you can, I know this from tutoring, you can take any subject and there's quizzes. It's open source from teachers all over the world. There are millions of free questions, and they have an API that could be inserted into just about any mobile app. And there's an unlimited source of questions. I'm wondering if they have some AP questions on there, but that would be a quick solution.
That's great. Any other questions from the group?
Well, I have one. They said they need to see a way to demonstrate whether this works. So, I mean, there are educational researchers at various universities doing studies of things. So I suppose the thing would be to get it implemented in a lot of places and then have them study it and measure how the students are doing.
That's the only way to know. We know it doesn't work. We've seen that. I mean, I was talking to, I think, an elementary school teacher when I was doing a local tutoring program here, sponsored. It was part of the No Child Left Behind program. And I was talking to him, and he said that they had people from the prison system come around to elementary schools to check on grades and standardized test scores to see how many prison cells to build. No, because they knew that based on those numbers early on, here's who's going to end up in prison. So again, we know what doesn't work. And so I'm not sure why people would be resistant to something that has some possibility.
So should this be turned into a computer game?
I think it can. And I'd actually, you know, rather than own that, I'd rather, you know, and spend years building it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather outsource that or open source it and have it built, and maybe have people just pay a small licensing fee for the rights or something, but to have it globally, because have you seen what students can do?
Well,
you know, it's amazing. I've also coached speech and debate, and And if you ever watch a high school policy debate team, you'll think, how do they know so much more than members of Congress in the United States? You'll be that impressed.
Yeah.
So I know there are like online groups of people who come together to create a game or to make modifications to an existing game, and it's all on a volunteer basis. So I'll just throw that out there.
That people come together to play
No,
games?
to create
To create games.
These are
yeah.
people who some have different skills in the programming part and others in the artwork
Oh, yeah.
part. And they just form a, and these would be like young people who are just getting started in the business and do this, and then they can put it on their resume or learn from it or whatever.
Well, think about it. How many people would rather, go to a training program, for some business and be able to do a project or a game, as opposed to, we need you to, because a lot of these e-learning programs, you think it's modern because you're reading it on a computer screen or an iPad or a phone. It's not. It's the same thing from a workbook that's just now on your computer screen.
Yeah.
It's no different.
No different.
And you think just by scrolling through to the next page, the next, like, it looks modern. It's not.